Scott Benton is the MP for Blackpool South. Until yesterday, he was the Tory MP for that constituency. But now the party has stripped him of the whip after he was caught apparently agreeing to break parliamentary lobbying rules in exchange for cash. Benton was caught out when Times journalists went undercover, posing as representatives of a British Indian company interested in investing in the gambling sector. Benton has long been an advocate of loosening restrictions on gambling in England, and has even campaigned for a licence to build a super casino in his own constituency. He's also chairman of the All-Parliamentary Group for Betting and Gaming. The journalists were tipped off by a Westminster insider that, despite a series of lobbying scandals, MPs were still keen to pocket the cash of private companies in exchange for parliamentary favours. The Times reports this. Betting companies have launched an extensive lobbying campaign in Westminster, spending more than £180,000 on corporate hospitality for dozens of MPs since 2021, amid moves to toughen regulation to tackle problem gambling. The much-delayed white paper setting out the government's proposals for legislation is expected to be published after the Easter recess. To test the allegations that MPs were prepared to break the rules, the newspaper set up a fake company complete with a logo, website, and office addresses in London and Chennai, and contacted 8 MPs by email. MPs were told the investment fund was seeking an expert advisor because of concerns about the turbulent political and regulatory landscape amid a significant review of gambling laws. They said that gaining insight from policymakers is a key part of our strategic investment strategy. The work would take a day or two a month, they were told, and there would be a compensation package. Benton took the bait, meeting the journalists over a cup of tea. They explained that they were looking to invest in the gambling sector and wanted, quote, behind-the-scenes knowledge of how gambling regulation might be changed. What, they asked, could Benton give them that a lobbying firm couldn't? Here was his response.
That's a very good question. Probably the direct ear of a minister who's actually going to make these decisions. So, two different, I'll be entirely honest, I'll speak as a non-politician, having worked in PR in the past. PR agencies are absolutely great. They have established set of contacts. They know how to work the room, etc. The one thing they don't have is direct access to a government minister. We vote in House Commons 2 or 3 times a day. We'll be voting later. You will literally stand at the beginning, at the entrance to the voting lobby, and if you wait there for 5 minutes, the minister has to pass you, and then you've got 10 minutes while you walk around to the next vote to have his ear. We can obviously put parliamentary questions on the table, so PCMS questions on Thursday, so we can ask things in a direct manner in public to see if the reaction we get is consistent with what we get in private, which isn't always the case. There's written questions as well, where we can table things on the public record and get an instant response within 5 working days on any question whatsoever, which obviously nobody else outside the political realm can.
Now, tabling a question in Parliament for a private firm in exchange for money, even if the MP declares an interest, is a breach of Parliament's rules. But to prove his claim about tabling questions for private firms, Benton took out his phone and appeared to show the reporters how he'd done it before.
Oh, there we go. It was 2 weeks ago, 17th of February. So there's a written question. So that was sent in on behalf of one business, essentially.
Right, where am I looking at the top here?
This one here. The Office of Product Safety and Standards conduct an investigation into regulators for repeated breaches of the regulator's code, and within 5 days you get a full answer.
Great.
In response to that answer as well, you get a private note from the minister, which sometimes tells you information he couldn't put in the public domain.
And you don't need to say with that, it wouldn't be public that we've asked you to do that. It would just, you just get the response. And
I'd have to declare an interest.
Right, okay.
But I wouldn't have to declare what the interest is.
Right.
So as long as I've gone on the public record and say I'm declaring an interest because I may be connected to an operator in the gaming world who I've had contact with in the past.
They got him good, huh? But Benton wasn't just answering questions. He had some ideas of his own about how he could help the fake firm gain an advantage.
Meeting with advisors, I think, is urgent. Meeting with the minister himself, Stuart or Lucy, would be absolutely fantastic, although probably less likely than meeting Stuart, who's the direct minister responsible. Tabling some written questions to try and flesh out the government's intentions on X, Y and Z, and then probably writing something more formal and having me sit down with the minister and go through it line by line.
I've supported other colleagues' particular asks in meetings when they've spoken to company X, Y and Z, and I'm sure they would return the favour as well.
All that money and he still wears an awful tie-shirt combination. Another breach of the rules there. MPs are banned from giving instructions on how to influence Parliament. Now, if you're a private company looking to invest in the sector, it can be very handy to get advanced knowledge of the details of proposed government policy. And that's where the conversation went next.
Would it be realistic to get advanced sight of the white paper, for example, when it's sort of finally decided, or anything along those lines?
Probably. That would only be a number of days, so...
Okay, so that would still be useful for investment?
Yeah, for a bit of account site.
Absolutely. I could guarantee you would get that within 48 hours of publication, for example.
Before publication?
Yeah, I would make something that to make sure that happens.
Great.
Unbelievable. Soon the question of money came up.
What sort of, would you have a figure in mind? What sort of compensation would you be looking for?
I'll leave that to you. I think that'll be remiss of me to give.
I mean, we were thinking probably in the range of £2,000 to £4,000 a month, but I don't know if that sounds in the right ballpark.
Yes, I think yes. Yeah.
Now, we need to be clear here. Benton didn't actually break any parliamentary rules. He simply said that he would for a few grand a month. And it may be that Benton also turned himself into the parliamentary regulator. In a statement, Benton said this: "Last month, I was approached by a purported company offering me an expert advisory role. I met with two individuals claiming to represent the company to find out what this role entailed. After this meeting, I was asked to forward my CV and some other personal details. I did not do so, as I was concerned that what was being asked of me was not within parliamentary rules. I contacted the Commons Registrar and the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, who clarified these rules for me and had no further contact with the company. I did this before being made aware that the company did not exist, and the individuals claiming to represent it were journalists." But if he didn't break any rules, why has Benton had the whip withdrawn? Tory Chief Whip Simon Hart released this statement. Following his self-referral to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards earlier this evening, Wednesday, Scott Benton has had the Conservative Party whip suspended whilst an investigation is ongoing.
We know that corruption is endemic in British society. We had the Casey report recently into the Metropolitan Police, in which was full of so many horrific revelations that the fact that the police force was found to be widely corrupt was barely even covered. That's the state we've reached. And we recently had up to £10,000 a day offered by fake companies to Matt Hancock, Kwasi Kwarteng, Graham Brady, leading Conservative Party politicians, former Health Secretary, former Chancellor, head of the 1922 Committee. These are people with enormous power in the apparatuses of the British legislature and the British state, taking cash for influence, or at least trying to do so. And of course, a few journalists mocking up a sting can only really scratch the surface of what must be happening all the time when corporations who are better at doing these things privately and quietly get to politicians. And it's one of the reasons that democracy and capitalism make for such awkward bedfellows. If you have high degrees of economic inequality, the people with money want to keep their money. They want to use the state to help them keep their money. And they'll spend a bit of money, which is a tiny amount of money for millionaire and billionaire corporations. They'll spend that money ensuring that they keep their privileges and power. What are the real world effects of that? Well, Public Health England estimates that problem gambling, costs Britain £1.27 billion a year. That's money in healthcare costs and in housing costs, in ruined lives that the state and communities then have to pick up. So we, taxpayers and others, pick up that cost, £1.27 billion a year, in devastation being wrought by companies who pick up big profits. 60% of the profits of big gambling companies, 60% of the profits, and almost 90% of the gambling yields come from just 5% of problem gamblers. So this is how they work. They start by getting people in with low stakes betting, sometimes loss leaders, betting on sports usually, and then they push people into slot machines and casino games, which are higher stakes, lower likelihood of reward for the customer, and generate big money money for the gambling companies. That's why during the pandemic, they were able to move this model online and make huge amounts of money. The owner of Ladbrokes saw its core earnings rise 11% in 2020 alone to £850 million. 800 million of that came from a 50% surge in online gambling. So what these companies are doing is sucking money out of the high streets where they locate themselves, or out of people's bedrooms and people's homes when they move online, sucking money out of often working class people, often people who don't have that much money, pouring it into the real boats that the government doesn't want to stop, which is the yachts that go to the owners of big companies. That's where the money is being pulled from working class communities across Britain. It's ending up in redesigns for those fancy yachts of the people who own these companies. And then the people who own the companies lobby politicians successfully to ensure that they're not regulated. That's the kind of racket of British capitalism. Constant redistribution from the bottom to the top, because British capitalists don't have any kind of coherent growth strategy except that sort of parasitic redistribution.
Scott Benton's apparent willingness to accept cash for influence might spell the end of his parliamentary career. At any rate, with a majority of just 3,690, his Blackpool South constituency is one that Labour will be keen to take back at the next election. So, will he be missed? Let's have a look at his record.
Personally, if it was down to me, I would bring back the death penalty for a small number of cases. I'm not afraid to say that, and that's a view favoured by the majority of the British people. Abortion is an issue for me. I remember one of the first public speeches I gave was at university to a pro-life audience on the issue as well. So obviously people have their own different views on abortion, but my concern is sometimes we speak about people's rights in society, but sometimes the most vulnerable of all people and human beings within society is sometimes forgotten, and there's nobody more vulnerable than an innocent unborn child as well. Our public services are already creaking under enormous pressure, and we simply can't accept hundreds of millions of people who would no doubt look to come here for a better life. I am afraid this country is nearly full. The Human Rights Act handed power to unelected judges both at home and abroad, meaning that Britain remains tied to a foreign court. The creeping power of the courts is directly interfering with the government's ability to conduct its business, not least in preventing the Home Secretary from combating the unacceptable numbers of illegal immigrants crossing the Channel. In light of this, does my right honourable friend agree with many residents of Blackpool in thinking that it's time we scrapped the Act altogether? But I believe that supporting this motion gives a green light to the intransigence of the Palestinian Authority and the terrorism of Hamas in Gaza by suggesting that the current policies of the Palestinian leadership befit a sovereign state, which they do clearly do not. What we have seen over a number of years now are hard left-wing fruitcakes gluing themselves to bridges, gluing themselves to trains, gluing themselves to road, and stopping 99% of the tax-paying public getting to work and going about their daily business.
You know what? It couldn't have happened to a nicer guy.